From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. During our first half hour today, an extended visit with K-State's Mike Apley, one of the foremost authorities on the issue of antibiotic resistance as it relates to livestock production. Mike talks about the current dialogue on that subject among human and animal health experts. He points out some of the public misperceptions that continue to exist, discusses the implementation of the Veterinary Feed Directive as a response, and stresses the importance of good stewardship in using antibiotics for human and livestock health treatment moving forward. Also today, K-State's Charlie Lee will look at a new bait product that's been developed for feral hog control. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Thanks for listening. Well, it's been just over half a year since the new Veterinary Feed Directive regulating antibiotic use in livestock feed took effect. That action, of course, was in response to escalating concerns about bacterial resistance to antibiotics in the environment, of consequence to both human and livestock health. A K-State veterinarian who specializes in production medicine and clinical pharmacology continues to serve as one of the nation's leading researchers responding to the issue of antibiotic resistance. You've heard from him several times on this broadcast. And just a couple of days back, Mike Apley discussed where things stand in a conversation with the K-State Radio Network's Richard Baker, starting with the scope of the challenge at present.
Well, in relation to antibiotic resistance, we've developed a human medical and an animal agricultural industry, if you will, both of them really an industry that's really dependent on the use of antimicrobials, antibiotics, for prevention, control, and treatment of disease. So from my aspect as a veterinarian, especially involved in food animal production, the concern is, are we in food animal production using antibiotics in such a way that would hasten the reduction in efficacy of antibiotics in people? And in my area of work, I also have a concern that we have areas in animal medicine, both companion and food animal, where we are seeing bacteria that are no longer susceptible to these organisms. So we have developed all these new antibiotics or discovered them, and when we find a bacteria that's resistant to one, we have another one. And when you go back and look at the history of the first clinical use of an antibiotic on the human side and when the first reports appeared in the literature of a significant resistant pathogen, 6 to 8 years, just almost like clockwork. So that's the concern, is that we've had this bloom, and now we're on the back end of it. And it's the realization of what I tell to our veterinary students in the first lecture of antibiotics and pharmacology when I teach it is, I start out, I go, I'm sorry. My generations and the generations before us probably haven't done the best job of thinking through and managing these antibiotics. And so now I'm going to turn this over to you with a large number of resistant organisms that you have to deal with.
The news stories, some of the people who are against antibiotics seem to me to lead you to believe that antibiotics are just an automatic thing to do when you're raising food livestock. Is that in fact the case?
Well, there are a lot of places where current production systems use antibiotics to prevent or control disease. Tylosin for liver abscesses in feedlot cattle, used throughout the feeding period. I wouldn't say all, but a very, very high percentage of dairy cows receive an intramammary antibiotic at the time they're dried off in order to decrease the incidence of clinical mastitis when they have their next milking cycle. There's other industries where, the time of weaning pigs is a time just like weaning calves, where we have a high disease challenge a lot of times. They're stressed, they're removed from their mother, they're put in larger groups, etc. So it's a group question I ask to meetings. I like to ask this is, who in here thinks that modern agriculture is dependent on antibiotics? And more veterinarians will raise their hands than producers. But in reality, modern ag is developed so that the people still in business today, in a very narrow margin commodity business, have evolved to make the most efficient use of land, water, labor, fuel, feeds, modern technologies, herbicides, pesticides, antimicrobials, antibiotics. All of these things we've used, they're available, and the cost of those related to the price of what we're developing and the other inputs has led us to use those very efficiently to control disease. And by controlling that disease, it's allowed us to have animal production system types that we may not have been able to have without that ability to control disease. You still have disease in a widespread pastoral production system, but when we bring animals together and concentrate them, yes, we can increase the ability for disease to transfer. We have a lot of other things we do to control that. All in, all out in pigs, incredible biosecurity in pig production. Beef cattle, how we wean the calves, fence line weaning them, letting them stay close to mom instead of putting them on a truck and sending them, backgrounding programs, stalker programs between weaning and the feedlot. We do a lot of things. We use vaccines. We do testing for biosecurity. We do a lot of things, but the reality is, yes, there are areas in animal production where we use antibiotics to control or prevent disease. It helps animal welfare. So the question is about stewardship versus judicious use. So judicious use is when I use an antibiotic, either your physician does or I as a veterinarian use an antibiotic. We've made that decision to use it, and now we're going to use it appropriately. We've assured that you actually have an infection, or I have an animal with an infection, or a herd that has the disease challenge. And then I'm going to use it at a dose that's effective. I'm going to use it for just as long as I need to, and I'm only going to expose the people or the animals that absolutely have to have it. That's judicious use. Stewardship brings in the part of me doing everything I possibly can to avoid the need to use the antibiotic. So we start communicating on different levels sometimes. I can cover you with paper that these different antibiotics have the effect we use them for, and that the animals are safe, and that we have tolerances that assure there's no harmful residues, etc. But the question being asked is, well, why is it that you have to use them? Which is a completely different question of, well, why do you use them? Well, we use them because they work, and here's the reason we need them to work. No, the why isn't that. The why is, what's the structure that requires you to have to use that? And that's really where the question starts. On the human side, there's still emphasis on prevention, but it's a different why, if you get my drift. On ag, we're being asked about the nature of the production systems that have evolved to very, very efficiently produce food at a very low cost in a very economically successful country where across the population a very small percent of our income is used to buy food. A lot of things raveled up there in there.
I want to go back to something you said. You said when you ask the question, more veterinary hands go up than producers. Why?
Yeah, and that's not a scientific survey, but that's when I talk to veterinary meetings and producer meetings, because frankly it's insulting to producers or veterinarians to have it insinuated that we're not doing something right. And what we're doing is we're taking care of the resources we've been placed in charge of. and that includes our animals, the people that work with them, the environment, the land. And don't interpret what I'm saying for a minute as saying the people that are out there in ag aren't being good stewards of all that. But the issue is that I think today we're more aware of some of the potential untoward consequences of using these tools than we were in the 70s, 80s, or 90s. One of the big things that's happened in the relationship between veterinarians and producers on the food animal side is the advent of the Veterinary Feed Directive. As of January 1, 2017, all medically important antibiotics, meaning ones that are also used in people, that are used in food animals through the feed have to be authorized by a veterinarian. Before that, they were over the counter. And when you look at kilograms of antibiotics sold in the United States in 2015, about 97% were over the counter through the feed or water, meaning they did not require a veterinarian's authorization. As of January 1, all of that went under veterinary control. A prescription for in-water use, a veterinary feed directive, which is related but a little different, for use through the feed. So a lot of conversations have happened. I've been a part of a lot of them and talked with a lot of veterinarians and producers working through this. But since January 1, 2017, there have been a lot of conversations now between vets and producers about the use of these antibiotics for their intended uses. And in the feed, there's absolutely no provisions for extra-label use. So that's been a sea change, if you will, in the relationship of veterinarians and producers. That veterinary oversight on antimicrobials, and I use that term rather than antibiotics because it contains a wider array of products, that relationship has really changed. And there have been a lot of discussions about what's really needed, where it's being used, and how it's being used. I can't overemphasize how big a change that's been this year. When drugs are approved for use in food animals, they go through a lot of rigorous testing and requirements, and one of them is that there is established what is called a tolerance. And a tolerance is a concentration of drug residues that may be in the edible tissue that, based on a standardized daily consumption estimate, that you could take that in your entire life and not have it cause harm to you. In the past, that was always done strictly on the direct potential for the drug to have toxicity to you. Now, since about 2000, there have been additional requirements put on where any new antibiotic approved for use in a food animal also has to have an evaluation of what's called microbial safety.
So if there's nothing in the meat, why are people so concerned about it?
The concern isn't so much that there's the antibiotic in the meat. It is the potential that antibiotic use in agriculture might lead to either a direct antibiotic-resistant pathogen that comes with the meat, or it might be that there is a concern that by somehow having even non-pathogenic, so bacteria that can't cause disease that are on the meat or in the environment, that we take in and those genetics become ingrained in the bacteria in our intestines, and then when we use an antibiotics, it might select for them, or those resistance genes might be able to be passed to one that can cause disease, for example, a salmonella. So the CDC in 2013 released a list of bacteria that are especially problematic for people. There were 18 different ones because of resistance. There's really two that you could say direct link through the food, and that would be Campylobacter and non-typhoidal salmonella. And they're a fairly small percentage of the overall cases, and especially of the deaths. E. coli, you get into this reservoir of resistance theory where resistance genes selected for by antibiotic use in food animals could somehow get in the environment and circulate back to people and increase the load of bacteria with resistance genes that could potentially be selected for then by antibiotic use in people. Here's what I've come down to. It's equally unreasonable to assume that the vast majority of antibiotic resistance in humans is due in any way to antibiotic use in animals. It's also equally unreasonable to assume that antibiotic use in animals has no relationship to antibiotic resistance in people. The answer's in there in the middle somewhere. What it comes down to is, hey, antibiotics are incredibly valuable in human and veterinary medicine. They are one of the few drugs we use that its very use decreases its potential to be useful for us in the future. So we better be paying attention to stewardship. And so there's another little interesting quirk on that. So I'm a DVM with a PhD in boards and clinical pharmacology, so I think about science and pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics and duration of therapy and Cmax and MIC and all this stuff, right? But what I've missed until recently when I've really got it is that that's probably 30 or 40% of what really happens if I was a physician and you my patient, or if I was a veterinarian and you were in here as a client with a patient. The vast majority of what happens between us is societal and social. And so, for example, in human medicine, the data would show that in pediatric bronchitis, maybe 1 out of 5 patients truly needs an antibiotic to recover, to change the course of recovery. But a physician to say, well, only 1 out of 5 really need this, so we're just going to wait and see if you need it. The 1 out of 5 that comes back that really needed it and they missed it, there's a societal price for that. You're ticked, or you're ticked because I didn't give that to your child. When I said, well, we're going to go and wait and see on your child, and you come back in as a parent with a kid who's still got 101 fever 3 days later because I decided I was going to wait to see if we needed antibiotics. So the societal and social aspects, a veterinarian, the same way with someone with 500 calves on feed that are starting to develop respiratory disease. I could, well, let's just wait and treat each one as it gets sick. Well, we're going to have more get sick, and we'll get to them later in the disease process. So we may lose some that we wouldn't have otherwise, or have animal welfare issues, and we're also going to have decreased production because I chose to wait because of this nebulous problem out there. As a scientist, I've been guilty of ignoring the social aspects of this, and so we're working on that. There's a group here in Kansas. This is the Kansas group that works on hospital-acquired infections and antimicrobial resistance, which I'm fortunate to be a part of. And we're working on these issues. I've also had the great opportunity to be a part of the Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria, which was to advise the Secretary for Health and Human Services on antibiotic resistance. And through that, I've had the opportunity to meet and work with some incredible people from both the veterinary and the human side. This September, we'll be giving our final report and voting on it for how we would incentivize new vaccine development, new anti-infective development, and new diagnostics, which would help us, back to the bronchitis example, say, oh, you are the one that needs it, or you aren't.
Are we in a position right now where you think we're going down the right road as far as taking care of our herd animals, the things that affect us the most, the food that we get?
I think so. There's a real recognition within the pharmaceutical and biologic industry that our future is non-antibiotic alternatives. And one of the things to, again, come back and be clear is our food animal producers, I'm convinced that everything they do is in the best interest of a safe and healthy food supply and that animal being capable of producing safe and healthy food. And they're committed to the welfare of those animals. It is a situation where we are learning along with everyone about what the optimal balance is, and we're very aggressively evaluating new non-antibiotic therapies, preventative practices. But again, it's important to emphasize that it isn't like, oh, well, we're starting that today in 2017. I mean, as long as I've been a veterinarian, and that's been since 1987, we have been very focused on how we prevent this. How do we prevent the need for respiratory disease therapy or prevention in cattle? I mean, as with antibiotics, how do we vaccinate? And another really neat thing that's happening with the huge advancement in genetic analysis is realizing that disease resistance heritability is actually worth is actually high enough in the mid 0.2 somethings in some species to pay attention to. And we're actually making, we as in other really gifted researchers, we as a society are making progress in identifying gene markers that would allow us to select breeding stock with higher disease resistance, a dairy cow more resistant to mastitis. Here at K-State, researchers at the College of Veterinary Medicine have been part of the gene delete pig that they've removed the site on the cell where the PRRS virus, porcine respiratory and reproductive syndrome virus, can bind to cause disease. And that's one of the big viral disease problems in pigs. It's a huge challenge. It comes in, and antibiotics won't work against it, but it'll sure work against the bacterial infections which can follow behind it. So they've developed a pig, normal pig, looking pig, but it doesn't have the target for that virus. So it's able to have that virus just come in, hang around, and no place to get a foothold. So there's amazing things like that happening that are very encouraging for us to move ahead to be able to balance that very efficient food supply we have today, very economical food supply, while still circling back and taking a look at how do we make sure that antibiotics last for us. And it is very important that as a veterinarian and a food animal producer that we maintain the use of antibiotics for humans, but it's also very important as a veterinarian for me to see that we maintain the availability of antibiotics so that the next generation from the young men and women who are training to be veterinarians today can use an antibiotic to affect the outcome of an infectious disease in an animal, just like I can today.
That's K-State veterinarian Mike Apley. A status report on the antibiotic resistance issue, of great interest, of course, in human health, but with definite repercussions in livestock production. Mike sharing his latest thoughts with the K-State Radio Network's Richard Baker. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Man, it's hot out here. Heat stress affects more than just humans. It also affects livestock. Extreme heat, humidity, wind speeds, and cloud cover all make a difference in air temperature. To control problems, make sure your livestock have shade and water provided at all times. This will help prevent problems in breeding, meat production, and reduce chances of death. Please take all these into consideration for livestock production. Brought to you by K-State Animal Science Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and now to today's agricultural news headlines for you, these courtesy in part of DTN. The Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report for this week from the USDA shows that the heat of last week has in fact taken a toll. For the week ending this past Sunday, topsoil moisture supplies in the state, 2% surplus and 56% adequate, but 42% short to very short, while subsoil moisture supplies, 1% surplus, 65% adequate, and 34% short to very short. The condition of the Kansas corn crop this week, 60% good to excellent, 31% fair, and 9% poor to very poor. Corn silking now at 72%, that's near the average, and in the dough stage at 8%. That's well behind the average of 23% for the date. Soybean crop condition in Kansas, 55% good to excellent, 38% fair, 7% poor to very poor. Soybeans blooming at 61%, that's ahead of the 49% average, and soybeans setting pods at 15%, that's very near the average. As for the grain sorghum crop in the state, 64% good to excellent this week, 30% fair, and 6% poor to very poor. Sorghum headed at 11%. That's very near the average. The third cutting of alfalfa, 49% complete. That's well ahead of the 31% average. Range and pasture conditions in Kansas, 64% good to excellent, 30% fair, and 6% poor to very poor, while stock water supplies are at 1% surplus and 92% adequate, only 7% short to very short. Well, nationally, the heat has clearly left its mark on corn and soybean stands, as we get in this report from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey.
The week ending July 23rd was not particularly kind to most crops.
Corny ads was not an exception.
We saw the percentage of the good to excellent ratings dipping to 62%, down 2 percentage points from last week. Very poor to poor ratings up a point from 11 to 12%. So as we've been mentioning for many weeks now, this crop comparing unfavorably to last year when we had 76% good to excellent and just 5% very poor to poor.
He notes declines in states like Indiana and Nebraska.
And South Dakota and North Dakota, even with marginal improvements, still have the worst rated corn in the nation.
Meanwhile, he says 2/3 of the corn crop is silking, while 8% has reached the dough stage. Both figures are behind the 5-year averages. Soybeans are in a similar situation.
For soybean condition, we saw a fairly steep decline in the good to excellent ratings from 61% last week to 57% on July 23rd. Very poor to poor ratings jumping from 11 to 14%. And we have 4 states with at least 15% of the crop rated very poor to poor, starting with South Dakota at 34%, North Dakota at 23%, Indiana at 17%, and Nebraska at 15%.
As for soy crop progress,
unlike corn, we're actually a little bit ahead of the average for soybeans, 69% blooming, 2 points ahead of the 5-year average of 67%.
Meanwhile, he notes 29% of the soy crop is setting pods, which is 2 points ahead of the 5-year average. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The USDA has long overseen programs to promote consumption of commodities based on the theory that the government has a stake in maintaining strong markets for U.S. farm products. The programs are prohibited from lobbying Congress. However, program opponents flew to Washington, D.C. recently to meet with lawmakers and to push for legislation that they say will bring needed reforms. At issue, the mandatory fees for the programs. The Hill reports that even though the funds have been used for such popular campaigns as the Got Milk ads and the Beef It's What's for Dinner campaign, there are those who are contesting those programs. Critics are arguing that those programs promote policies for industrialized agriculture and not small farmers and ranchers. The recent fly-in this month was organized by the Humane Society of the United States and the Humane Society Legislative Fund. One of the opposition bills is called the Opportunities for Fairness in Farming Act. It would enforce greater transparency on how checkoff funds are used. This act would require checkoff programs to publish all budgets and expenditures of funds and to submit periodic audits by the USDA Inspector General. And yet another reform bill called the Voluntary Checkoff Program Participation Act, which was introduced in the House, would take that previous act a step further by prohibiting the compulsory checkoff programs altogether. Many of the attendees at this gathering were hopeful that the Trump administration would back their push. Now it's on to the weekly feature for you dairy producers from the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State, Milk Lines. And as always, with that is K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I'd actually like to talk with all of our Kansas dairy families. We have a nice event over in Salina each year. It's called the Kansas All-Breed Junior Dairy Show. It's held again this year, August 17th through the 19th. Lots of events for all of the young people that are interested in the dairy industry. So on Thursday, we start with getting animals in place with entry, so that'll be on Thursday, August 17th. Then on Friday, we have lots of different events for the young people. We have a state dairy cattle judging contest that'll take place in the morning. Then in the afternoon, we have a state quiz bowl contest. We also have a dairy skill-a-thon that people can participate in, as well as a banquet that evening. And then on Saturday, we start with the All Breeds Junior Dairy Show. So we'll have fitting and showing first, followed by the breed judging later on in the morning. Hopefully should wrap up by about noon on Saturday, August 19th. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to go to the K-State website and just type in Junior Dairy Show, and it'll take you to a website where you can actually register your animals and for the different events. We'd like to have all of those reservations and entries in by Friday, August 11th. And again, you don't have to necessarily show an animal to participate in some of the events that we have on Friday. So if you're interested in just coming and participating in State Quiz Bowl or maybe the Dairy Skill-a-thon, you're more than welcome to do that, as well as the judging contest. And then if you're also interested in showing animals, well, you'll need to bring those over on Thursday, and then the showing will actually be on Saturday. So this is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, inviting all of our dairy families to the Kansas All Breeds Junior Dairy Show.
Mike, many thanks for that calendar item. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. Our weekly stint on wildlife management with K-State's Charlie Lee is coming your way next here on the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever wondered why livestock producers burn Kansas pasture? Here's the deal. Controlled burning helps preserve the prairie and allows every bite feeder cattle eat to be the most nutritious. National Wildlife and Parks also feel it is a necessity to help with wildlife populations.
So the next time you see a Kansas pasture burning, know it's for the good of our wildlife, our prairie, and our livestock. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. Our time set aside to talk once again with wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. Charlie, there's been a development in the area of feral hog control that we want to discuss today, but the feral hog damage problem continues to manifest itself a lot of places, including in Kansas.
Well, the annual economic loss that's been attributed to wild hogs, or feral hogs, feral pigs, feral swine, wild boars, has been estimated to be over $1.5 billion across the United States when you include crop damage and the costs of control. That's a tremendous loss, and unfortunately, current efforts are not keeping up with the wild hog expansion. Those populations of wild pigs are increasing throughout the United States, as well as many other parts of the world, including Australia. But the folks here in Kansas that have been responsible for feral hog control have done a good job, and that typically our populations are at least static or decreasing, but that's not the case in many other states where the feral hog population was much higher to begin with, and perhaps current control efforts were started much too late. Current control efforts have been involving things like trapping and snaring, recreational hunting or shooting, professional sharpshooting, and even aerial shooting. But even with all of those techniques, the population and the damage has continued to grow.
Because of the difficulty of controlling feral hogs, there's been a building interest in what control products or baits could be placed in the wild to deal with them.
Yeah, toxic baits seem to be a solution for some problem animals. We've looked at toxicants or rodenticides, those products that are used for rodents, and generally those have a public acceptance. Unfortunately, we've not had good acceptance of toxic baits for things that are of a larger mammal, like a feral hog. But there are some products that have been developed specifically for feral hogs. One toxic bait is registered for wild pigs in the United States. It's called Kaput. It's made by Symmetrics in Colorado. It's a warfarin-based toxic bait, but it's not been approved for use in any state. There's a couple of other active ingredients that are used in toxic baits in Australia, but again, those don't have acceptance or registration here in the United States. So there's been a more humane and less hazardous chemical, sodium nitrite, that's been proposed as the active ingredient for wild pig bait. So consequently, the process of getting a bait registered and accepted is ongoing.
And toward that latter product, then, the improved bait, if you will, that may have greater promise in being accepted as a solution, that's under testing right now, you say, or has been of late?
Yes, those products are under scrutiny now because of suspected problems with humaneness and then possible effects on non-target species. But sodium nitrite is considered a humane toxicant because it causes rapid loss of consciousness followed by fairly quick death from loss of oxygen to cellular tissue. Mortality has been reported for less than 4 hours after pigs ingest a lethal dose of the product. Additionally, sodium nitrite has a reduced risk of secondary poisoning because it is metabolized out very quickly and has very little potential for bioaccumulation like some of the anticoagulants like warfarin may have.
There have been other angles that needed to be examined as well, you say, though, through recent research, the palatability of the product, the durability of it, and so forth, right?
Yeah, so this particular research project was just reported on in the Wildlife Society Bulletin in the June issue. Had three objectives, and that was to determine the lethality, the palatability, and how long the bait remained effective. It is a micro-encapsulated sodium nitrite product. This project was designed to take wild hogs that had been captured, kept in captivity in outside pens, do a research trial that tested palatability, lethality, and longevity of the toxic bait.
And how did the product perform under this evaluation?
Well, they found that the product, which is called Hog Gone, was a preferred food item. Feral hogs ate it quite readily. Once they consumed about 1 pound of toxic bait per animal during the first night that it was offered, they've got a 95% mortality of the pigs that this was tested on across 2 treatment nights. But 98% of those feral hogs died the first night the toxic bait was offered. So it appears to be accepted very well. So it must be very palatable to be accepted that well. Mm-hmm. It's also fairly lethal when you look at a 95% mortality on the test group across the first 2 nights. So those 2 items, those 2 objectives were met very well. And then they found that the product kept very well. Even after 8 months after the product was produced, the microencapsulation kept the product very effective, and they didn't have any differences in lethality or palatability after the 8-month delay before the bait was used. So it appears to be another option out there. Still got lots of steps to go through the registration process, but it looks like we may have another product on the market here in the near future for feral hog control.
You say that the next hurdle that may have to be cleared, though, is preventing off-target species from consuming this bait.
Yeah, the next step will be developing some sort of a bait station that's going to exclude non-target species and evaluate the effects of this if some non-target species get into the bait or happen to feed on the carcasses of wild pigs that may have died from sodium nitrite. So there's more steps to go, but I think we're looking at a possible additional tool here in the near future.
And particularly in states where feral hogs are a real menace, this could be an added solution in controlling feral hog damage. Charlie, thanks for reporting on this. Charlie Lee is a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. That's our Tuesday edition. As always, we appreciate you being along with us. We'll return this same time tomorrow. Hope you'll be back with us then. In the meantime, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.